Welcome back to the channel if you are not new here, and if you are new here, welcome. This series began after a verbal assault I faced one day during a bike ride, and while that particular incident was a catalyst for me questioning the unification of Black/Afro women, the question has always kind of existed within me, especially being someone who has been isolated for the most part, from other Black women. The difference between my perceived experience when I was younger and how I feel now is that I'm more willing to question if this isolation is like a personal distaste of myself, or if there are actually a lot of systems in place keeping us from truly being unified and accepting of one another in many different facets. The myth that I'm speaking on is the myth that I believe a lot of mainstream media has perpetuated, which is that Black women are also unified and we stick together and we all have this group of reliable and loving homegirls and we're all just there riding and dying for each other. I believe that this myth is toxic and that it needs to be addressed because I'm calling it a myth for a reason. I have one friend and it's not because I'm not a friendly person, okay? So with that being said, this is the third installment of my Unified Black Women myth, and I do apologize that it has taken me months to compile this video, but I wanted it to be a little more cohesive than the previous installments. So with that being said, you can somewhat compare this series of mine, this small, intimate series, to Nola Darling's My Name Isn't Street campaign. My name isn't emo bitch, it isn't slut, and it isn't ugly. My name is Andrea, and this is Hello Drea.
So long, sad times, go long, bad times, we are rid of you.
Zora Neale Hurston's 1937 novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, in summary, is an exploration of womanhood, identity, romance, and love through the lens of our main protagonist, Janie Killix Starks. Let's not worry about the names, okay? Just know that she's kind of like on the Kim K trail when it comes to marriage. So when the novel begins, our main protagonist, Janie, who was, by the way, played by lovely and infamous Halle Berry in the movie adaptation, at the exposition of the novel, our main protagonist, Janie, is, well, really our only protagonist, if we're being honest. She is returning back to Eatonville after burying her third husband, and that is a spoiler alert for, anyone that hasn't interacted with the book yet or seen the film. At the exposition of the novel, Janie is now widowed for a second time, widow squared, if you will. No? I understand. Okay. Sorry. Now, I'm not going to get into every single piece and really just tear this novel apart, but I do highly recommend that you read it if you haven't. Colorism, classism, and sexual immorality. For the second installment, I played off of Ann Petrie's The Street and pulled from those themes, and I had a commenter that I don't know if he was purposefully, just kind of being a detractor, or if he sincerely felt like perhaps my analysis of the book wasn't doing justice to my topic, which is, of course, the unification of Black women. So while in that installment, I opted for mainly letting you all draw your own conclusions off of what I was saying, for this one, I'm going to choose to just tell you what my intention is, and you can tell me whether or not I landed it, but I'm pretty sure I did. To summarize, classism, colorism, and sexual immorality are all three tools of division for Black women. Prior to World War II, Black women were actually the most married group of women in the United States, and I will link my source for that below. However, as more of us are seeing, divorce rates, specifically in the West, are growing and may continue to grow. Meanwhile, marriage rates are also lower or closer to being stagnant. What that means is that either people are, one, no longer having to be married out of necessity, specifically women, just because prior to, I believe, 1974, we couldn't have our own bank accounts without a man either in our family or a husband co-signing for us. Owning property became a thing, I believe, before that. In a nutshell, women have not had the range or the opportunity to really be self-sufficient. We have systems in place that have made it to where, historically speaking, and somewhat presently, a relationship, specifically a marriage, was non-negotiable. So it should come as no surprise that in the early 1900s, our protagonist, Janie Killix, is a racially ambiguous Black woman, and her grandmother, who has raised her because her mother has taken off and her father is also not in the picture, is concerned about her well-being. Nanny states that she did want Janie to school out, or in other words, continue her education. But one afternoon, when Janie is about 16 years old, her grandmother wakes up to find her kissing Johnny Taylor, who is a teenage boy, presumably around the same age as Janie herself. And Nanny is concerned about this. She's concerned about how often this has been happening and if perhaps things have gone any farther than kissing. Now, as the book doesn't allude to Janie having any type of sexual interest or really being aware of herself as a sexual being prior to this experience and prior to seeing the pear tree by her house blossom. Nanny, like most Black matriarchs, assumes the absolute worst when seeing Janie come into herself. With that being said, she marries Janie off because she does not want her being trampled all over by men, or in other words, being sexually immoral and loose. Janie is a Southern belle, and aside from the fact that she is a Black Southern belle, there is a certain level of purity culture that exists in this time period that is perhaps unfounded, now, but not too long ago was this still a thing. We can see this in examples of adultification of Black girls, and if you've ever seen a Black girl with straightened hair, she is considered growing up too quick or being made to look grown. That's why we always have to bump the ends and things of that nature, things that basically imply that there is a level of purity there, because Black women and girls are automatically presumed to be impure and incapable of really possessing innocence. So Janie is married off to a man who is probably about 40 years her elder, and he is an established man. You know, he owns a farm, he owns plenty of acres of land, and in Nanny's mind, Janie is going off to live a very good and luxurious, somewhat life, especially considering their surroundings. Nanny comes from a working class background. She and Janie basically built themselves up by the bootstraps and had to, Nanny specifically had to work in the houses of white people. And that was how she made her own living. And experiencing this, as all generations, we want our offspring to live better and have better choices than we were presented with. It's no different for Nanny. Nanny wants Janie to have the absolute best life possible, especially seeing as she is beautiful, but she is beautiful and naive. And that is a very dangerous combination for a woman in any time period. But again, I must emphasize that at this point, Janie is not a woman. However, Nanny sees her as a woman because she sees her becoming presumably a sexual being, and therefore she is grown and she must be married off to do all of the grown shit that she wants to do. Janie saw her life like a great tree and leaf, with the things suffered, things enjoyed, things done and undone. Dawn and doom was in the branches. Obviously, 16-year-old Janie does not want to be bedded up with this old-ass man that she finds unattractive. I forgot what she said his head was shaped like, but she was complaining to Nanny about it, and Nanny was basically like, "You're so silly, he did not create his own head." These are facts. Nanny was speaking facts. However, I think most of us can understand, once again, why the necessity of marriage was such a problem for women back in the day. And again, even presently. You know, not having a choice in actually being in love and having to depend on a man for sustenance isn't ideal for anybody. Nobody wants to just be strictly reliant on means that are outside of their own. So it's no surprise that one day when her husband goes into town and she waits at the end of the fence for something. She doesn't know what she's waiting for, but she knows that she's waiting for something to happen. A figure walks upon her, and this figure is none other than the reason that men specifically benefit from the system of women being oppressed financially, or being socially exiled without having a man to validate them. The way that they benefit from this is the fact that they understand, and I would say that this is nearly universal for all men. You know, we have a lot of conversations presently about high value men being sought after, but at the end of the day, even the lowly men are sought after because they are social capital, or perceived to be social capital. A single woman is innately seen as being toxic, undesirable, perhaps even crazy, especially if she is perceived as attractive, because as we know, an attractive woman has her options and is approached more often than a woman who is not perceived as attractive. It says in chapter 4, long before the year was up, Janie noticed that her husband had stopped talking in rhymes to her. He had ceased to wonder at her long black hair and finger it. 6 months back, he had told her, "If I can haul the wood here and chop it for you, it look like you ought to be able to tote it inside. My first wife never bothered me about chopping no wood nohow. She grabbed that axe and sling chips like a man. You done been spoiled rotten. So what does this mean? Essentially, it means that while a man does view your beauty and your youth as being valuable, he still also wants your labor, whether emotionally or in this case, physically. That's where women are capital, socially and also physically, tangibly. What Logan is saying here is that he has no desire for simply just a pretty woman to sit up and be in his presence, breathing in his air, and inheriting all of the luxuries that his provisions give. So when Janie is waiting at the gate for something, anything, and when the figure of Joe Starks walks upon her with his swagger and his confidence and his rhymes, essentially, she falls victim to the game. But fortunately for her, and somewhat unfortunately as we'll see later, he means everything that he's about. He tells her that he is on his way to Eatonville, which is the first established colored town, all colored town, and that he's going to be a big name there, as he always wanted to be, but was unable to be in Georgia due to racism. So this suffocation of their desires and their character being relegated to people's perceptions of them, those are things that Joe and Janie can bond over. She wants to be somebody, but specifically, she wants to be somebody that is loved. He wants to be somebody, period. And whether or not love's got anything to do with it, he knows that a somebody very much has great social capital in a woman that looks like Janie. So it's no surprise that he takes her to be his bride and she leaves her first husband. For a contemporary and real life example, we can take Jay-Z and Beyonce. Alright, Teen Noir has a video on Beyonce's unrelatability, but one of the key takeaways of that video is the fact that Beyonce serves as outstanding social capital for Jay-Z. People follow his moves very, very closely, and it isn't just because he's a great businessman or an uber successful person financially. This paradigm is in no way dissimilar to the relationship between Janie and Joe. When he comes into this town talking about, I'm going to make a post office, I'm going to do this, I'm going to create a general store, the other men there who have really done nothing to establish this town, and it's pretty ramshackle upon their arrival, they're like, one of them specifically is like, who does this guy think he is? And he's got to be joking. A black man running a post office? Yeah, that'll be the day. Meanwhile, he's also very much aware of Janie's presence and very much aware that a woman like that is not going to follow the lowest common denominator. Not really. As is pointed out by the man that he is speaking to when he kind of blows off Joe. The other man says, you can't get a woman like that with a fish sandwich. Pretty women, it takes money to feed them. Which would also infer that the other women in the town are very much capable of being beguiled by a fish sandwich. In other words, the bare minimum is acceptable for most of them. This is a divisory tactic. Women not liking each other based on appearances and based on pretty privilege, which I'll probably get into that later on in the channel. I spoke on it briefly in the first installment, but I don't remember if it made it to the final airing. But I did speak on it, and I don't know if it made it, unfortunately. But I have a lot of thoughts on Pretty Privilege, and they will be explored more elaboratively at some point on this channel, I guarantee you. And even before this specific cocktail of privilege and respect that comes from Janie being married to who will soon become the mayor of this town, and also is the wealthiest person there, and by default making her one of the most wealthiest people there, really the only wealthy people there, so to speak. Janie is already very much aware of how divisory her looks are. When she and Nanny were younger, she was being raised by Nanny, and Nanny worked for white people, as I mentioned, but prior to them getting their own home, they lived on the premises of the white people that Miss Nanny worked for. The hand-me-downs from the white people that Janie wore to school were still far, far more illustrious than what the other colored children were wearing. And she specifically speaks on a girl named Mayrella, who was a naughty-headed girl that was always teasing her for living in the white folks' yard. So Janie is already very much aware that other black girls or girls of color don't approve of her and don't feel that she deserves any type of status that she has.
Okay guys, I know I've talked a lot in this video, so here are some of the keynotes I'd like to provide. Number 1. Before we even reach the climax of the novel, Janie is twice married to men of valor and wealth. The options her beauty afforded her were inaccessible to the vast majority of her black female counterparts, making her unable to relate to or even bond with them. The only exception, of course, is Phoebe Watson, the dear friend she is narrating her life story to. Number 2. The disenfranchisement of women has historically and presently made male companionship sought after with little regard to actual love and companionship. with little regard to love and compatibility. The quickest way for another woman to hate you is to love your man. Number 3. Loose or sexually immoral women are a danger to themselves and stable relationships because loose women are not socially valuable. Number 4. Being light-skinned helps. These 4 keynotes have and will continue to divide black women until we educate ourselves, heal, and ultimately unite. I'm Andrea, and this is Hello Drea. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Until next time.
About it now, happy days are here again. Your cares and troubles are gone. There'll be no more from now on. Happy days are here again.